welcome, Dr. Emily Kline, to Hope Stream. I'm very, very excited to have this conversation with you. We were just chatting, like, how is it that we have not become connected before this? So I'm glad to be doing this today and thankful for your time. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. And yeah, it's good to talk to someone who, I feel like we live in the same world very much.
Right? Exactly. Yeah, working with families and, um, from different angles. Obviously, you come at it from more of a clinical angle, you do a ton of research and all that. And I'm sort of like feet in the fire with families, on a day-to-day basis, in the moment sometimes. But yeah, it's an interesting world, especially today, some of the things that are going on. And what I really love about your body of work is your focus on motivational interviewing, among other things. But I think that's one tool that I feel like is kind of it's a little bit of a secret that I don't know so many parents know that they can use it so effectively. So we'll definitely talk about that. But let's get a little Dr. Klein 101 and see just a little bit about you. How in the world did you get interested in psychology and motivational interviewing? And then we'll jump in from there.
All right. Sure. I'm used to motivational interviewing 101, so you've turned the tables on me. But yeah, I'm originally from Pittsburgh. I went to college for English literature of all things. I really didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. Um, And I was a young college student. I started at 17, so I kind of picked something a little bit random. I realized, oh, wow, if I pick this major, all of my homework is just reading novels, which I really like to do. Um,
Smart.
yeah, seems like a little bit more interesting than all those textbooks. But then I have an altruistic nature, and I really felt an intense calling to kind of be useful in this world, do something good with myself. And the way I got into it actually was kind of random. I was 20 and I took a break from college, like a little bit of just a mental health break, a bad breakup break. And I was looking to do something with myself, and my friend's mom hired me as a file clerk at a day program for people who were in recovery. And I loved it. I just started hanging out with all the patients. And my boss there, who ran the program, said, go finish your college degree because I'll hire you. You're a great counselor. And so that's what I did. So she hired me with my English lit degree, and then I worked there for a couple years. And then she's a great mentor. Her name is Jessica Feldman. We're still friends, and this was 20 years ago. So she said, it's time for you to be on your way. You need to go get like an advanced degree in this. You have a great career ahead of you. And I followed her advice, and that's how I got into it.
Oh, that's amazing. What was it about working at that clinic with the patients that you liked?
Oh, what a great question. Well, the program was called a clubhouse, and it's a really lovely model. The idea is that it's not really a clinical space. You don't have any doctors or anybody doing therapy in the space. The idea is that it's kind of like a community center, and you have a few staff, and the job of the staff is to engage the patients in kind of running a community center. So my job would
Hmm.
be, hey, we have 30 people here today, and we got to make everybody lunch. Um, so my job was to go around and try and get people to help me, make the lunch, and then we do the dishes. Then I'd say, okay, let's go do inventory in the back. Okay, now we got to go to Costco and refresh our supplies. Now we got to deep clean the oven. Um, and so the idea was that people need to be needed. We need to have a purpose in order to get going in this life, especially if you've been out of work or isolated. And so the idea was to create a very, very low stakes kind of almost simulation of work.
Right.
where you could practice being needed and try it on and see how it feels. And it was really fun for me. I was so young and it was genuine when I was like, I really don't know how to deep clean an oven. Do any of you know? So I was kind of good
Right.
at it from that angle.
That's awesome. I love that. It's so interesting to hear the stories, that lead people to where they are, because I often find there is something like that that's just really pure and really special that brought you into it. Were you using motivational interviewing at that point, or where did you first come across this technique?
We did a like 2-hour workshop on it one day at that job, and I thought it was cool, but I didn't really internalize it. And then I went to graduate school to do my Ph.D. in psychology, and I learned a lot of things there. Obviously, it's a lot of classes you take to get that degree. And motivational
Yeah,
interviewing
that's
was like in the mix. Um, and I did learn it from someone who was he was one of the guys who wrote the trans-theoretical model, which I know you're familiar with, you've referenced it in other episodes. One of my professors was Carlo Di Clemente, who kinda came up with a lot of that stuff. But
he was your professor?
yeah, yeah, so I learned motivational interviewing from him, which was a good experience, but again, it wasn't my thing. It wasn't my number one specialty. I
Right.
was just kind of filing it all away. And then I got out into the field and started practicing, and it was really the only thing I found that I used every single day. I was like, "Well, thank goodness I know this
Mm.
at least. Like, this is something I can do." And I used it constantly, and I realized it was really of all the tools that I had added to the toolkit in graduate school, I thought it was my number one most useful. And then I was doing so much work with families because, I mean, obviously, the families are just so important when you have a young person who's struggling, whether it's with mental health or addiction or both. And I started really connecting with the families and working with the families and realized if I can teach the families some of these skills, they'll be so much more empowered at home. And really, they're the ones, I see this young person for 50 minutes once a week, sometimes every other week. But the mom or the dad, I mean, they're home with them all the time. So they're really the ones who are going to have
Right.
the most impactful interactions and conversations.
Yeah, it's one of those things that you really can use at the dinner table, or, even at 2 o'clock in the morning, right? When things are stressful and a little crazy, that it's just one of those tools that you can apply, I think, across the board, for the most part. Why do you think it's so? Was motivational interviewing developed? It wasn't developed for adolescents, was it? Was it developed for people with substance use, with
That's my
al- alcohol
understanding.
use disorder?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Yeah. Okay.
So the developers are two psychologists named Bill Miller and Stephen Rolnick. And my understanding is that they developed it in the context of alcohol addiction treatment in the 1980s. And they kind of articulated this principle that was kind of an outgrowth of like very sort of person centered, non directive psychology. And it was really radical at the time because, I mean, still in our culture, we have this idea of an intervention, right? Where you kind of get in somebody's face and you tell
Right.
them, hey, you're ruining your life, you're hurting other people, you need to change. And that if you can deliver a really forceful and compelling kind of speech like that, that's going to get somebody to see the light and want to change their behavior. Um, and Carl Rogers, who is a psychologist, who really created person-centered therapy. He wrote, um, "The wild thing." I'm probably getting the quote wrong, but the wild thing is that it's only when I accept myself exactly as I am that I can change. So really
Mm.
turning that on its head, this idea of an intervention and saying, no, it's when people feel accepted, when they feel heard, when they don't have anything to fight against. That's when they can explore the possibility that
Mm.
maybe they are ready to try something new.
That's a great way to think about it. And for adolescents too, because I feel like in adolescence, there's just this natural pushback, right? There's this natural, like, I'm going to do it my way, even if they're not struggling with anything. It's just sort of the way that teens are and young adults to some degree. So I think, and I'd love to hear your experience in watching how this works, in particular with young people who may not have a fully developed prefrontal cortex, because that's a lot of the frustration that I think as parents we face. We're just like, oh my gosh, they don't have a working brain yet. Um, how do you see it working with adolescents? And maybe compare and contrast that to what you see with adults, if it's different.
So I think there's more similarities than differences, really. I mean, I think that we all kind of get defensive when people criticize us or give us advice that we didn't ask for. I know that I do. If even if the person is really well intentioned, it often feels kind of like critical or condescending, like, "Oh, you don't think I already thought of that?" or "You you think I'm dumb?
Right.
You think you can do this better than
Right.
me?" And so I think that we have more in common than different with adolescents. But I do think that they have really, intense autonomy needs that they want to assert.
Mm.
And if you want to make any kind of progress with teenagers, you have to respect those because otherwise it's just a power struggle from A to Z. And I think the other difference, as you're
Yeah.
saying, is that, you know, adolescents compared to older people they can be more impulsive. They value peer input a lot. That can be a good thing if you can leverage it right. So for instance, like you, if the hope with I always have for my patients is that they meet a girl or they meet a boy and that person doesn't like the smell of marijuana, right? And because that's a peer influence, that's
No.
so much more powerful than anything I'm going to say. But so they really value peer input and they value short term benefits more than we do. And they tend to see the upside of things more than the downside of things. And that is like, I think, really a treasure. I think that I love teenagers. I think they're cool. I mean, they're definitely cool. Like, they think that we're horrible, right? We're so risk averse.
Right.
We're so cautious. We're so anxious. They are willing to try new things and take risks, and they're so loyal to their friends. I mean, they have so many wonderful qualities. And so I think, but it is just a different perspective.
Yeah. Well, and I think they're also probably used to being sort of talked down to or parents are trying to control. And I know I'm going to have you just break down sort of the core elements of motivational interviewing since I probably should have done that in the beginning. But I think a lot of parents, we try to control
Yeah.
and control and control and control. And so they're used to that. So what I have seen with professionals like you who I've observed either live or on video using motivational interviewing with an adolescent is they're a little shocked sometimes, like, why isn't this person telling me what to do? It's just like such a different approach that they are trying to figure out like what what's going on. And then they open up because you're not trying to control them. So maybe you can we'll rewind to where I just got so excited talking about all this, but we should have you just frame up so that if somebody's listening, they've never heard of this or used it, and what are the core elements and what is the goal of motivational
Yes.
interviewing?
All right. So the basic philosophy is that we simply cannot control other people. Um, and that makes a lot of sense as a therapist, right? Because it doesn't really matter what you say in the room, the person's going to go out there and live their life. And so if you don't want them to drink alcohol or use substances, or you want them to take a medicine or, exercise, it really has to come from their own motivation. Um, there's very little that we can control about other people. And um, the flip side of that is that people are most receptive to suggestions and advice and trying something new when they're feeling understood, confident, and in control. So we all want to control our own destiny. And people will be really can be very self-destructive just to prove that they're in charge. And so we never
Right.
want to talk to that part of someone's psyche. We want to talk to the
Yes.
curious, optimistic, mature, like, what could I do differently? Part of someone, not the, screw you, you don't know me, you back off of my life part of someone. And the idea is that we all have both sides. We're all ambivalent when it comes to making changes in our lives. So we want to communicate with people in a way that helps them feel not judged, but understood, that helps them feel like that kind of curious, like, what could I do? Um, and we, as much as possible, want to resist giving advice unless we're really sure that it's a good time to do it. So there's a couple really simple ways to do this. Motivational interviewing isn't super easy and people do train a lot in it, but I like to just emphasize the really basic skills, which actually are, they're not easy, but if you practice them, they get a lot easier. And so those skills are like starting a conversation, not with a whole lot of information or giving advice, but from a stance of curiosity and sort of respect for the other person's autonomy. So, for instance, if I wanted to start a conversation about cannabis use with my teenager, I wouldn't walk into the room and say, hey, here's an article about why this is terrible for you. And you better stop doing it or else I'm taking away the car keys. Right. That's rooted in sort of,
Which is probably what
yeah.
99.9% of us do the first time.
Yeah. And it's very understandable. And by the way, if that worked for you, then like do it again. Congratulations. No shade from me. Like, I'm just a practical person. If that
Right.
works for you and your family, that's awesome. You're probably listening to
Well, and
this
let us know
podcast. Yeah, yeah.
because I confess
I'm guessing that your listeners are people that didn't work for.
that exactly.
Yeah. Um,
Okay, so we're not
so
going
we're
to
not
do
going to do that
that.
because that's, trying to control and also just sort of information overload. But instead, walking in and going, hey, I've noticed a smell of cannabis from your backpack or in the car or whatever. What's going on? And just trying to come at it from a non-judgmental perspective and learn as much as we can before we direct or prescribe. So that's kind of the first thing is not trying to control or fix, but instead really rooting ourselves in curiosity, in non-judgment, and then using really good non-judgmental questions and using a lot of reflections to try and get into a non-defensive, like back and forth conversation. So what that would sound like is, going on with this scenario that I described. So you say, okay, I noticed that the car smells like weed. And your teenager says, no, it was my friend. It wasn't me. I wouldn't do it. Why are you even asking me? Has this defensive
Of
reaction.
course, mom, it's never me.
Yes. But yeah, they say, oh, okay. It wasn't you. It was your friend. Whether I believe it or not, right? I'm just going to reflect what I hear back. And the point of it is just to get the other person talking and just to say, hey, listen, I just want to hear what you have to say. Let's take a break from me yelling. Let's just take a break from it. I'm just going to put the spotlight on you and I'm going to reflect back what you say. And I'm going to say, oh, so, what do your friends think of cannabis? Or, what is the attitude in your school toward it? Um, and whatever my teenager says, I'm just going to commit and reflect. I'm just going to reflect. And usually that can get somebody talking. So those are kind of the basic skills is like these open-ended questions, reflections. And then I think the other really essential piece is prefacing advice with like labeling it as advice and even asking, hey, so I appreciate you sharing your perspective on that with me. Um, I've been doing some research on marijuana too. Do you mind if I share what I've learned? Right. And just
Mm.
asking that permission. And if somebody says no, it probably means you're wasting your breath. Like it's not a good time and you can come back to it another day. But usually, if you've kind of heard somebody out, they'll say yes. And then that's when you have your chance to say, well, I'm really worried about it because, I'm worried about the THC content in these products, or I'm worried about, your academics flipping, or that you've been, it seemed like I didn't really have a problem with it when it was just at parties, but now it seems like it's an everyday thing. Um, and I really would appreciate, thinking together about if you're interested in using less, or even framing it as a question, like, well, what would you think about using less? What's your motivation to use less? Is it none? Or are you actually curious about that? Have you been trying to use less? Um, because the idea is that if we come at people who are a little bit motivated with a lot of like lecturing and scolding, then they just get defensive and they're not even willing to talk with us. And it's like, oh, that person actually was motivated. Like they were curious, they were interested. And now we've kind of
Mm,
blown that conversation. But you'll get another chance. I always tell parents, you'll get another chance.
right, right. You'll probably have another chance to smell weed in the car.
Yes.
It's what we always say. So, what if I'm thinking about even myself and a lot of the families that we have in our communities where this has not been the mode of conversation, right? So maybe it's been a year and there's just been a ton of power struggles and headbutting and lecturing and threatening and punishment, taking away the phone, or taking away the computer, or taking away the car, and blah, blah, blah. And now somebody is like, oh, well, okay, maybe I should try this motivational interviewing thing. First question is, how do you start to shift your voice, your conversations, because it could be a very like 180, right? Like, well, yesterday my mom was screaming at me for this. And then today she's asking me, well, tell me about it. Like, is there a right or a wrong way to sort of transition to using motivational interviewing? And then I have another question, but let's go with that one first.
I don't think there's a right or wrong way. I think that a lot of parents are worried that it's going to feel like fake and weird. And it does when you first start doing it. It feels weird to you. It usually doesn't feel weird to your kid. They're just like, oh, this person's being nice to me. Like they usually are not that like, oh, like, why, But even if you are, one of my
Right.
friends one of my colleagues who really helped to develop some of this content with me. Her name is Teresa McIntyre, and she's a family advocate in Boston. I mean, she put it so beautifully. She's like, "Well, if my daughter asked, I would just say, yeah, I care about you, and I'm trying something new, and I'm not very good at it yet, but I don't want to fight with you." And it's like that, just that little bit of sort of vulnerability, I find so endearing, and I think is very disarming to even a teenager, hopefully. Because believe it or not, they have noticed that you're not great at communicating if you've been yelling at each other for a year.
Yes. Spoiler alert, right? Like, there is no mistake that this is not working. Yeah, and I say the same thing too. And like, well, heck, what? Give it a try. I mean, it can't hurt, right? If what you've been doing hasn't been working. And yeah, you might get a weird glance. And I think that's also really good role modeling to say, hey, I'm willing to try something new. I'm willing to set down my yelling and screaming. Maybe you could think about setting down something as well. So I think it can start to pave the road for a little bit better conversation. What do you do though if your kid says, I am never going to stop smoking weed? Like, okay, mom, I'm going to not take those pills anymore because I know there's fentanyl and you don't want me to die and blah, blah, blah. But I'm never going to stop smoking weed because I get it at a dispensary. It's totally fine. I have a card. And so don't bug me about that.
It's a good
Like,
question.
is there a response or do we just have to say, okay, and let's say this is an 18-year-old just because this is a typical situation that our families
Yeah.
get into with the 18-year-old who gets a medical marijuana card and is like, back off. I'm doing this for the rest of my life. It works for
Yeah.
me.
So, this is a good example where I can come up with a reflection that I would use in that moment. And again, this isn't about controlling the outcome. Like, I can't guarantee that this is going to turn around the situation immediately or ever. But what I would say to that 18-year-old, if they said that to me, is so you feel really confident in your decision and you don't see it ever causing any problems for you. That's a
Yep.
reflection. And
Okay.
sometimes that will just, I would say a lot of the time that person would say, yeah. And that's okay.
Yeah.
That means I haven't done any damage. I didn't change their mind, but I showed them that I can hear and respect their perspective. And so maybe they'll be more willing to talk again with me in the future. So that's not a bad thing. And then the other
Yeah.
piece is that sometimes when you, it's like when I feel like when somebody says something like that, what you just said, I'm never going to stop. Stop bugging me about it. They are picking up, it's like a game of tug of war, right? And they're picking up the rope and they're yanking. And what I did when I reflected was I dropped my rope. I didn't yank back. I
Mm,
just dropped it.
right.
I said, okay, I hear you. And sometimes the conversation goes in a more interesting direction from there. Not always, but sometimes when there's nothing to kind of fight against, people will be
Mm,
more vulnerable and more interested in exploring.
right. Like when you said that, I was thinking, well, I might say, well, I don't know if it's never going to be a problem, but it's not a problem right now. So I
Yeah,
don't
and
need
then
to
I
kind
would
of
say, so
worry
now I'm
about
like
it.
fully in the role play because this is what I do with parents. I just role play
Right.
with them. I would say, okay, so what for you would be the warning signs to look out for? Because now I
Oh,
have you
that's a
thinking
good
about
one.
it, you know?
Right. Right. What are the warning signs that would, how did you say that again? I always,
So if you said, okay, so you said, I'm never going to stop. I said, okay, so you don't see it causing any problems for you ever. And you said,
right.
well, maybe not ever. And so the question I would have would be like, okay, so what would be the warning signs that you'll be on the lookout for yourself? I'm not going to put it on you, but I'm curious.
Mm,
I want you to think about it. I don't want me to talk at you. I want you to think.
right. Right. And you know what's so interesting about the way, even the tone of your voice, the way you're saying this is not, it's not that snarky kind of parenty, like, oh, what would you look out for? Right. Like we can get in, I think you can sometimes say the same words with a different tone of voice and it completely ruins the whole
Yeah.
intent behind what you're saying. Because the way you're
Yeah.
saying it, and I think maybe it's easier too if you're not like the parent because you're not so emotionally invested in this
Totally.
person. But maybe we can try, if you are the parent, just try putting on your therapist hat only from a like an emotional distance here, or like you're the auntie or you're the
Exactly.
next door
Yeah.
neighbor or something like
Right.
that.
Like you don't have to be the therapist, but like, yeah, pretend this is your niece or nephew, like someone who you love, but you don't feel so responsible for the outcome. And,
Yeah.
when I work with parents, I often ask them, when you were growing up, was there someone in your life who you really felt safe going to with a dilemma? And um, a lot of the parents, a lot of people did have that in one of their own parents, but a lot of people say exactly what we're saying, which is, yeah, it was my neighbor, it was my grandma or my aunt, because mom and dad were just too close to the problem. They couldn't listen without getting all activated.
Yeah. And it's hard to go into these conversations without wanting to control the outcome. Like you said, you're not trying to control the outcome. I think what we're trying to do is draw out information. And I think as parents, we often go into the conversation with a very clear goal that we are going to change your mind and you're going to see the light of day and you're going to go, oh, you know what? You're right. I do need to go to treatment. And again, I don't know that that's ever happened. I mean, I'm sure it has somewhere, but for the most part, that doesn't happen. So we have to find ways to resist that urge. to get to a specific outcome. Is that
Yes,
part of
and
this?
but what's
And how
amazing
do we do
about
that?
it is that it's like, not to be so fancy, but it's paradoxical, right? It's when we stop trying to control the outcome that, kids actually start confiding in us, and then you have influence. So,
Right.
it's a different, the point is not to control the outcome, but it also is. Like, I wouldn't have written a book about it if I really thought parents couldn't do
R-
anything. I actually think
Right.
that
Exactly.
if you succeed at this, then you do have more influence, but it's not through like the yelling and threatening and trying to close the deal right this second, right now, go to treatment.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a much more strategic means to the end that doesn't involve all of the drama and the yelling and the screaming. And that also, what I hear too from parents is they feel sometimes like, well, I'm making this, like, there is no yelling or anything going on anymore. So is that right? Like, my kid's doing a lot of drugs. Shouldn't we be, like, shouldn't there be a lot of emotion? Shouldn't there be a lot of, like, hard conversations? Because I think that's what we've seen, right? You see shows like Intervention, or you see these examples of like really confrontational situations. And then the person says, okay, I'll go to treatment. And so maybe we're hanging our hope on that, but it can feel a little, what I've heard from people is they say, well, it feels kind of passive. And I would ask, like, what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I'm not, I practice what I preach. So I don't do a sales pitch. It's just something to try
Right.
if you feel like it. Um,
Yeah.
and at the same time, I, it's like people often say, well, you just have to put your foot down, right? I hear that expression all the time.
Right.
And I always ask, like, so what does that look like in your house? What does that mean for your family? Um, and, it might mean a lot of yelling. It might mean threatening to kick people out of the house. It might mean taking away phones or keys or computers, like you said. Um, and then the obvious question is like, how's that going? And if it's going good,
Yeah.
then like, great, do that. And if it's not going good, try something new. I do think there's parents who are too avoidant. I mean, I think there's people who kind of don't talk about it at all. And I run a parent group that meets on Tuesday nights. And one of the things I really love about having a group is that, you get the parents who are like really comfortable with confrontation. And then the parents who like are like, okay, so I have to talk to my kid about this thing and I have no idea how to bring it up. And I've never started a conversation like this. And you get them to kind of talk to each other, right? So there's
Yeah.
parents who do need take a little more courage, I guess, to like get in there and have a difficult conversation. Um, and then there's people who maybe feel like they're so used to yelling but it's not doing anything and it doesn't feel good. Um,
Right.
and for them, being a little more strategic. I like that word that you used instead of passive. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because you are doing something, even if you're not doing something. So if you're not yelling, that's actually doing something. It's a little weird, but like you said, paradoxical. It's just, it is. And I always try to remind people, like, when's the last time you made a change in yourself based on somebody telling you that you needed to do it in this way, and that you were a bad person if you
Yeah.
didn't do it? Like, never. So, so that's, yeah, that's super interesting.
I would also say, like,
Trying to
for the
remember what.
parent who's worried that they're not doing anything, a way to reframe that is to say, I'm investing in the relationship. And that's what I'm
Mm,
working on right now, rather than saying I'm not doing anything about the substance use, to say I'm doing something about our terrible relationship that only consists of yelling at 2 o'clock in the morning. What I'm doing about that is not
right.
yelling at 2 o'clock in the morning and instead inviting and trying to interest my kid in other types of interactions, like getting some pizza or going for a walk or playing video games together. And that is not nothing. That's
Mm.
really, really important.
That is a really, really good insight because it is exactly what you're doing. You might say, hey, for the next couple of weeks, if you're co-parenting with somebody, let's drop the topic of weed and let's make a 2 week investment in the relationship so that we can get closer to being able to have the conversation about the weed. And what I'm wondering is if there are any, like, do you have any go to phrases that you find to be kind of door openers with, especially with adolescents or with young adults? If a parent is listening and they're stuck and they're like, well, first of all, we're going to make sure they get your book and they're going to do the online, the School of Hard Talks e-course because it's great. But let's say they haven't done that yet. Are there any phrases that you have found that are pretty good at sort of getting that door to creak open a bit with a young person to get them talking?
Oh, this is a great question. I have some really good ones that are coming to mind. So, the first is to start a conversation with the words I noticed. It's so like sort
Oh,
of nonchalant, like, "Oh, I noticed." And you make a really simple observation. It's totally concrete. Like, I noticed you haven't taken a shower in a while. I noticed, car smells like weed. I noticed you came home pretty late last night. Because it's kind of gentle. And then you stop talking, and just see what they say.
that's the hard
That's
part.
the hard part. Yeah. Another question that I love is when you are trying to get your kid to do something and they're not doing it. Like they're not going to their therapy appointment or they're not going to class, um, whatever. The question, what's getting in the way? Because it's very gentle. Again, it's non-judgmental, and it's a way to try and align with your kid about, okay, obviously something's getting in the way. What is it? And to start talking about that rather than getting into a back and forth about whether or not the thing is happening, and
Right.
getting into lies and denials and whatever. It's like, well, I noticed this, which means this. So what's getting in the way? So that is a question
Mm.
I always love to ask. And then another great question is, what could you do? If it's like, okay, I want you to go to therapy and you're saying that's never going to happen. So it's like, okay, well, what could you do? I'm going to put it back on you now. My job isn't to generate all the ideas. You, you take a turn.
Mm.
And again, not in a sarcastic way, but just in a genuine way. Like, I'm out of ideas. What do you think you could do to make the situation better? So those are 3 suggestions.
I love those. Those are great. And we should make like a little, like a business card size thing that people can carry around in there, or
Yeah,
maybe stick it on your phone.
when I teach
Because
this
the
to oh, go ahead.
oh no, I was going to say because I think the tendency is for us to say, well, why aren't you going to school? Why aren't you going to your therapy appointment? And the answer is usually, I don't know. I don't know. I hate that place. And then you're
Yeah,
nowhere.
yeah.
So
So
I
what got
love
in the
I
way?
love this just yeah, feels a lot better.
Um, when I teach it to, like, the medical students and the residents at Boston University where I teach, they like, I try to give them a little cheat sheet because 'cause they're learning so much. Um, and I'm like, "Okay, here's your cheat sheet. Just take a picture of this, and you can use it
Awesome.
next time."
That's awesome. Yes. Well, we need it because a lot of times you're, emotionally heightened. You're not in a nice, calm, like if somebody's listening to the podcast right now, they're probably out walking, like life might be pretty calm, but it's usually one of these times where you get emotionally kind of like up and you can't always remember these tools. So those are super great. So your book is out and just talk a little bit about what do you want people to take away from that? Like what's your hope and your dream for people that read it and
Mhm. So, on the
close it up and go, oh man.
I just hope that people find a little relief in it. I mean, it's called The School of Hard Talks: How to Have Real Conversations with Your Almost Grown Kids. And it describes these skills, and it also describes kind of the surrounding philosophy, which is that our impact is often like around the margin, And so I always start there with parents like this isn't your fault, right? But you can make a difference. And that's kind of the essential philosophy that our kids are not reflections of us. They're not ours to control. If they struggle, it's not because we did something wrong as parents, but by kind of being open and available for hard talks, and investing in the relationship, that we can have much more influence than we can by, yelling and screaming and taking things away. So I hope that's what people get out of it. And it's also kind of, I hope, a fun and easy read. A lot of the book is kind of written like a movie script. Like it's just kind of watching people interact. Like if mom says this, then the kid says this, then the mom says this, then the kid says this. But if the mom says this, then the kid says this, then the mom says this, then the
I
kid says this.
love it. Love that. Yeah, we need that because we just need to break it down into simple steps that we can, like you said, there's a huge amount of science and there's a lot behind motivational interviewing. But when you're working on using it yourself, there are ways that you can, like, if you can read through a script like that and go, oh, and even just the questions that you outline, it's like, oh, I think I could do that, right? Like, I think I could actually do that just as a layperson. So that's amazing. So yes, we'll put a link in the show notes if you're listening to the School of Hard Talks. I This would be a whole nother episode that we would have to do about why we avoid hard conversations. Like, why do we avoid these hard talks? Which we won't even try to answer now, but I guess I'm just queuing you up for another episode about that because that's a big topic because we tend to do it. Either that or you try to bulldoze through, and then neither one's effective. But any myths or misperceptions, either about young people, about motivational interviewing, or like the thing that you hear all the time that just frustrates you to death that you want to clear up once and for all for people who are listening?
Oh, so many. I mean, I think the biggest one is that this you say every episode, so I'm not contributing anything new, but um, the parents who come to my group and the parents who I work with a lot of them are just the nicest people who have been there every step of the way for their kids. So this idea that mental health problems, that addiction is a reflection on parents, and it means that parents screwed up. I think it does so much damage in our culture, and it really holds us back from working with families and with young people in a way that is most likely to be successful.
Yeah, I would agree on that for sure. And then the last question I have for you is, what do you love the most about what you do?
I knew you would ask this question because I've heard you ask other people, and yet I'm still kind of unprepared. So I would say, have you ever just walked into a doctor's office and felt so taken care of? Like just like, oh my gosh,
Yes.
this person just
Yeah.
really knows what they're talking about and is interested in me as an individual, and is going to just help me get through whatever it is that I'm here for. I've had encounters like that with really, really talented doctors and therapists. And um, if I come out of an encounter on the other end feeling like, oh, I just brought that person a lot of peace, that's something that really fills me up. And I feel great about myself. So that's probably my favorite thing.
Awesome. I love that. It is a very special feeling. I actually just had that experience this morning and I thought it's so wonderful that there's people out there who really are living their passion, right? You can tell that they are thoroughly enjoying what they're doing, taking care of people or whatever it is. And you can just tell it just radiates from them. So, well, all of your patients are very lucky to have you. We are super lucky that you wrote this book. So we'll get again, if you're listening, there will be a link in the show notes and you can get that. And also, there's an online e-course. I believe it is free, right?
Totally free. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's incredible. And we'll put a link to that as well. Thank you for the
Yeah.
time.
Thanks for
And
finding me and introducing yourself. This is
yeah,
great.
Yes, yes. I know it is so crazy that like I see your name everywhere because I'm a really weird like research. Like I don't do research, but I like to read research. And so I see your name, I see it on websites, and I was like, okay, we have to have this conversation. So I have a feeling there might be another one in the future. But
Wonderful.
thank you for
Thank
the time.
you.
Thank you for all the work that you do helping families and just lucky to have you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks. All right.
Okay.
That's where I will
Okay,
cut it off
beautiful.
there.
All right.